Welcome back to Where the Ramp Ends. I'm Bryce.
And I'm Summer.
And boy, do we have an interesting episode for you this week. We have comedian and disability advocate and personal friend of ours, Michael Beers. Man, I really enjoyed this episode of when Michael talked about how stand up comedy and disability history changed the trajectory of his life.
I really enjoyed this episode, and I'll just say that as a parent, listening to you and Michael talk about some of the challenges you face as individuals with disabilities really enlightened me as a parent. I enjoyed this conversation so much. Michael is so fun to talk to also. I mean, like, you guys, this was a fun episode. And I personally just love hearing about the history of disability.
Yes. And, it's not a topic that is a fun loving topic, but it's a needed topic. The history of disability and where we have come from, guys, it's not for the weak at heart, but it's a conversation that needs to be had and needs to be shared.
Definitely, and I would love to have more conversations about the history of disability. You know, a lot of schools don't even teach about the
No,
history of
no.
disability, so we gotta get it out there.
Yes. So if you're interested in having a laugh and maybe a few tears and learning the history of disability, check out episode with Michael Beers on Where the Ramp Ends.
Let's and with that, let's get that episode started. Here we go.
Back to Where the Ramp Ends. I'm Bryce, and boy, am I excited about today's episode. We have our dear friend Michael Beers joining us today. Oh man, am I excited about today's episode? So, I know that most of our fans on the Where the Ramp Ends podcast, we joke about this on every episode of the wish dream list that Summer had when we first started this idea of a podcast. And Michael Beers, ladies and gentlemen, was very high on that list. So,
Yeah,
Yeah.
so
An
definitely.
honor an honor to be on a list with, either one of you. Uh,
thank you,
Yeah,
man. So,
definitely.
Michael, if you want to briefly introduce yourself for the audience that may not be familiar with your work.
okay, absolutely. Oki Nistu ni Taniku Michael Beers, as a short introduction in Blackfeet, which is part of my identity. Um, I am sitting in my dining room with old 70s wallpaper behind me, uh, shorter, combed back black hair and a goatee, and a very loud, hoodie. As a visual description for anybody um, that may need that as well. Mm. I too am excited. I've been looking forward to it. I know we had to reschedule, but I've been looking forward to this all week. So
Michael, can you share a little bit about your life, a little bit about who you are?
yeah, absolutely. Our story begins on a cold day in 1982. No, we're not going to go back that far. But I myself am somebody who was born with a primary disability that is visible. So my disability is something called Vaterals Association, which is fun because it's one of those disabilities I get to explain to my doctor every time I go in to a new one, which is always great when the conversation begins. What is that from your doctor? Like that's really sets the tone. But Vaterals Association is an acronym, VATERLS, and each letter stands for a different symptom. And it's called an association, not because I have to pay dues, which if that was the case, I may not have it anymore. But because if you have two or three letters, the doctors know to look for the other symptoms as well. So for me, it presents itself with everything on my left side. This is my left hand in front of the screen. count them out with me. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 digits is bigger than everything on my right side. Now I'm holding up my right hand, which is drastically smaller, and shorter, and only has 1, 2, 3, 4 digits on it. But even that, if you're really paying attention at home, my ears are different sizes. So it affects, yeah, it affects general mobility, and some neurological stuff. Professionally, I am a comedian and advocate. So I found stand-up comedy and advocacy in the same 3 months in high school. I did stand-up comedy as a senior project, and it was love at first laugh. It was the first time in my life I was bigger, I was taller and louder than everybody else, and I felt like me for the first time, if that makes sense. And then a few months after that, I was fortunate enough to attend the Montana Youth Leadership Forum, where yeah, really embraced my disability identity for the first time. I think I know Bryce and I've talked about this. As a young person with a disability, identifying isn't always a comforting thing,
No.
because you don't want to be one of those people in that program. But the way
Yes.
YLF is presented and the people that create it really make it a different space that I was able to embrace. So yeah, my two careers I thought were very much the opposite of each other when I started have grown together in some cool ways. Being able to do stand up comedy and improv, um, and also work in advocacy for equity for
That's a good segue to my first question. Talking about our previous conversations about being a young man with a disability, can you talk about before YLF where your mindset was mentally as a person with a disability versus after you experienced YLF?
Yeah, absolutely. The befores and after. So I think before it, I really ran away from the identity of being a person with a disability because it made me other, right? So
Yes,
as much as we've progressed in society, we still deal with societal groups in the same way, especially when you're in school. So walking into a lunchroom, there was never a group of or a table for adopted Native Americans with four fingers. Like that just wasn't a group. So I tried to fit in everywhere else. So I paid attention to, what are other people wearing? What are other people laughing at? What music are you doing? What stories are you telling?
right.
And I became much more a student of my peers than I did the subjects in school because I wanted to fit in, whatever that means. And I got pretty good at it. I was able to kind of wear those different masks and fit in. But it was exhausting. It's exhausting trying to be somebody else. Um, and I suffered in school because of it. My grades suffered. I had some behavioral trouble just because I wasn't focusing on me and I wasn't focusing on who I was in an attempt to try to fit in where I thought everybody else was.
You know,
Real- yeah, go ahead.
I had the same kind of challenges. I tried to fit in myself, but I used, academics as my way out. I
Okay.
said, "You know what? I'm gonna, you know, use my brain and I'm gonna, you know, find a career and I'm gonna create a life for myself." And, selfishly, years ago, I thought that, if made all this money and I created a life for myself, my disability would disappear. And
Mhm.
the depression and the sadness would go away. But to be honest, like the idea of that made it worse
Mhm. No,
because
that
the
makes sense.
idea of college and stuff like that, and the pressure that professors put on you of like, oh, you have to take 30 credit hours a semester, to graduate on time. That I drank the Kool Aid.
Yeah.
I did everything that the professor said to do, but in having said that, I still wasn't happy.
Yeah.
I was still emotionally isolating myself from peers and things because I was afraid I didn't want to be judged or looked at different. So, did I go to social functions? No, not really. Um, I sat inside and played video games and did homework, and
Yeah.
that was my life in college. So, I get it. So, what was your the reason why I bring this up, what was your aha moment in YLF that was like, "I can
Mm.
live so much better of a life if I just plug in."
Yeah, absolutely. I think 2 things. One, it was the staff. So, when I say I didn't find comfort in disability identity before why I left, a lot of times it was because other people in my life with the best intentions would steer me toward programs for people with disabilities. Like,
Right,
oh, you like playing basketball. Here's a basketball camp for people with disabilities or a team. Oh, you like to do this. Well, here's a group of people with disabilities doing it. So it was always based on my disability and not my interest. And as well intentioned as people are, sometimes if it's not a program run by people with disabilities, it doesn't have that authenticity. So to me, and through my lens, every time I was a part of one of these programs, it was very much an after school program. I was like, okay, let's hold hands and sing songs and everything's going to be okay. And you just kind of get the impression that the program's more about them feeling good about themselves rather than, really impacting my life in a positive way. So my life, one of the first things of why I left in Montana, I noticed right away was a majority of the staff themselves had disability. Whether it was a disability I could see right away or in hearing them talk, they'd identify as having a non-apparent disability. And that immediately caught my eye because I was like, oh, okay, so you do have some kind of concept for what it is to be meet what it is to feel like you're the only one or to have these frustrations with teachers or IEPs. So you're coming to me through that experience, and that was a huge thing. And it also gave me examples. These weren't just YLF staff members. These were people with careers and professions and families and relationships outside of disability. So they automatically, became mentors in that sense as what was possible. I think the second thing that was really an aha for me and why I to this day, spend a lot of time talking about the history and culture of disability, which is how, all of us met, is because that was my first introduction was why I left. So I didn't necessarily know what the ADA was, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which was even more of a surprise because IDEA is what allowed me to go to public school, for all those years and have the accommodations that I had, even if I didn't
right,
like them. Um, and ADA would be the piece of legislation that gave me civil rights, at least from 1999 on or 1990 on. Um, but more importantly than the laws, it was understanding the stories and the people behind getting those things passed. So meeting characters like Judy Heumann and Ed Roberts and 1,000 other people that took over a building in San Francisco, in the '70s and literally slept on desks for weeks, in order for me, you know, and, a whole generation, after them to be able to have these opportunities where before we didn't. We were isolated either
right.
by societal norms or by physical institutionalization. So the stories and the meeting the people was really the red flag, or not the red flag, but the aha moment for me.
The stories that you tell are just remarkable, and it's kind of blows me away that more people don't know about him. So to be able to sit and hear Michael Beers tell about disability history is a great, honor and, something that it was one of my favorite things about partners. Um, so what kind of got you into this, doing partners in policy making, telling what led you to what connected you with partners and doing these
Well,
trainings?
while I answer that, I'm going to shut my camera off briefly just because I'm going to plug in my laptop so I don't die. The laptop doesn't die.
Yeah, no
Okay.
problem.
Oh, there. We'll just go. Trigger warning if anybody has motion sickness. We're gonna travel along this route. But yeah, that really is when I mentioned before that I didn't see comedy, even though I love comedy and advocacy. I didn't see them as having a relationship. When I got my first job at an independent living center, um, I was doing comedy. I was growing as a stand-up comic, and that was really my passion. So, and I saw my work in independent living as a great way to, have that day-to-day income in addition to Social Security, until, comedy took off. But it was really my community. It was really going to a conference as, a peer advocate and having my supervisor sign me up for the talent show, at the conference, uh, April, which I now work for, the April conference, and doing stand up in front of a few hundred other people with disabilities. It really started me down a path of like bringing that Venn diagram together where comedy and advocacy kind of meet in the center. So storytelling, and a comedic perspective became a bridge to other people, to tell my story, but also to tell those stories that inspired me to the people that hadn't experienced that yet. So yeah, that really, from that one conference and my supervisor signing me up, that really led to, oh, hey, would you mind coming to this conference and doing some stand up? Showing up. I think that's an under taught leadership skill is just showing up.
Absolutely.
And eventually, I remember the time I was in Arizona at a conference in Scottsdale. I looked at the program and it said Michael Beers, or instead of Michael Beers comedian, it said Michael Beers humorist. And I looked at a mentor of mine at the time, and I said, "What is a humorist?" And he said, "I said, what's the difference between a humorist and a comedian?" And he said, "Well, you get to tell longer stories, and you get paid twice as much." So eventually, yeah, my talks became more and more about messaging and less about comedy, until I could find that happy medium.
So, what's the biggest piece of advice that you can give someone that is really starting new in their advocacy journey?
Mm, mhm. I think a big one I mentioned is show up. So, I know I have friends. We're working on a Comedians with Disabilities Act comedy special with a
I
group
would
of
love to.
other comics with disabilities. And a few people that are working on the project deal with kind of perfectionism, to the point of like diagnosed OCD.
Yes, many
And
people.
Eh, and listening to the OCD, so, um, uh, shoot, Bryce, what does OCD stand for again?
Obsessive compulsive disorder.
Thank you, Bryce. But, them talking about how they had to get over this idea of perfection before they create. So, it might not be perfect, but it's never gonna get perfect until you put yourself out there multiple times. So you learn more by failing than you do by succeeding. So, getting out there and, don't put yourself in danger, but definitely push your comfort zone a little further each time you go to advocate is a big one.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point because you and I have a lot of similarities. We're both, you know, we both identify as a person with a disability. But having said that, I think it's so much harder also identifying as a male in a professional world that's also living with a disability. Until I found public speaking and I found advocacy, I really was forced with the idea of I'm gonna have to do something non-disability related to make income. And
And
I didn't realize till after I found public speaking and advocacy that my reason for being in a my reason for existing and the reason for my career I've been sitting in for 29 years.
mhm. Yeah, yeah.
So,
Well, to the first story, you find out once you find that comfort in identity, like I think there's confidence in identity. So when we're trying to be other people, when we don't know who we are, I think it's a very hard place to be authentically confident.
yes,
But when you find those spaces, whatever they are, I think for you and I, uh, public speaking, we found a comfort level and a bit of identity where most people don't. Most
yes,
people list public speaking under dying as what they fear. Like it's like
correct.
I'm afraid of public speaking. Number one, and then number two is dying, which I never understood. Like
I mean, to
it's a
be
hard thing
perfectly
to
honest
comprehend.
with you, I'll briefly share my first public speaking experience was at a Toastmasters meeting in 2017. They wanted me to play a mini game, which was, and they gave me a question prompt, kinda like improv, because I know you're big into improv, and they said, "You have 30 seconds to respond to the topic." And I said, "Do I have time to, look at the question and practice and kinda think about it?" They were like, "No, it's off the cuff. You start now." And I'm like, "Oh, crap." I don't even
Mhm.
think I lasted um, 15 seconds. But
Yeah,
what kept me coming back, Mike, was the constructive criticism. That was great, but here's how you can improve.
yeah, absolutely.
And that bug stuck in my ear, and I haven't been able to dig it out since.
No, it's true. Yeah. And you form a relationship with it. I think that was when I performed stand up for the first time in high school, and I'm really glad I found it when I did, relatively young,
Yes,
because um, we don't often intentionally, and this is one of my soapboxes, we don't intentionally address two barriers as a disability community that I think are kind of at the heart of a lot of other things
right.
that we do talk about more. We don't address intentional and with intention a lot the fact that regardless of diagnosis, whether it's a physical disability or mental health or learning, that one thing we have in common as a culture is we experience loneliness at a higher rate
Yes,
than our peers.
yes.
Um, and because of the isolation, because of the, hey, I can't participate in the world the same way you do. I can participate, but it's going to look different. And
Yes.
then the other one is confidence. We don't intentionally build up confidence, especially in our young people. And, we can see confidence in the form of, toxic masculinity or cockiness to a point where it becomes negative. But before you get there, confidence and ego are absolutely necessities for advocacy, for
Yes.
independence, for identity. You have to have that confidence in your own self to be resilient
You know,
when all these other things happen. Uh,
and I've never brought this up on the podcast, but But since you're here and you're a friend, I think it would be good for people to know, um, you're you are married.
Yes.
So can you explain, because you and I could have a podcast alone talking about how difficult it is to date with a disability.
Yeah. It's a tough one. I mean, it's tough in general. I think that's the thing. Every life is hard for everybody.
Right,
These times especially, but there's always something. What people, a really simple definition of disability is it just adds a layer. So take something that's hard, add a disability, and it just becomes one level harder. And dating, in that, and that's a lot of what I've dealt with personally. And then working in with youth in transition through the independent living center I was at for such a long time. It wasn't the funded project. It wasn't transportation, housing, or employment. But in creating spaces where young people with disabilities feel comfortable with you and the environment, as soon as people feel comfortable, they bring up romance and dating
yes,
as an area and as a goal. And if it's that conversation about do I it's disclosure, except it's not disclosing for an employer, it's disclosure in a relationship. How much do I tell my partner right off the bat? How
right,
much are they going to notice if I have a physical disability?
right.
I know a big question that we got a lot in the last handful of years where I'm old enough to where I remember online dating kind of being stigmatized and be like, "Oh,
Yes,
you met online, blah blah blah." To today where it's very much normal. Most people, meet each other online or through an app.
you
So
know,
if you have a physical disability, it's when I put a profile up, do I include a picture of me that shows my disability? If I don't, am I hiding it? Do I talk about it? And then when I show up and I haven't said anything, is the person gonna, be like, "Oh my gosh, gaslit me." So yeah,
exactly.
those are just some of the variables that pop up.
And that's funny you mentioned that because I've had, I'll make a joke with, people that I've dated before and say, when we go out in public, they'll think you're just my really hot nurse. And they're like,
But yeah,
"You-" and I've been stopped by people and say, "Are you his nurse?" And I'm like, they'll say, "No, we're dating." And they're like, "Oh, good for you." Like I'm some charity case. Like,
yeah.
like it's some kind of just some kind of magical thing like, "Oh, good for you. You did your good deed for the month, like you dated somebody with a disability. Good for you." Like, so if you don't mind, can you share with our listeners since we're the on that subject, can can you talk a little bit about how you and Mallory kind of met and kind of, you know, this disability kind of happy ever after kind of thing? Like,
Yeah. Well, we're happily ever right now. The goal would be happy ever after, but we're happily ever right now. No, I don't mind, Bryce. This is my favorite story. So and really my relationship with my life all plays a part in these other stories I've told. So without finding comedy, I don't become a speaker. Without finding a YLF, I don't find advocacy. And Mallory, my wife, and I met through the Youth Leadership Forum here in Oklahoma. So, because I'd gotten opportunities to be a public speaker at conferences, and I was such a champion of YLF as a alumni and a staff member in Montana, um, YLF started reaching out to me and saying, "Hey, would you come be a speaker?" And one of the first YLFs to reach out to me way back in 2005 was the Oklahoma Youth Leadership Forum. So I've been coming to Oklahoma 2 days a summer, every summer since 2005. And I would talk about, do 1 day of disability history and culture training with some leadership uh, in there. And then during the commencement, I do more of a stand up storytelling. And I don't know, I think it was 2014 or 15. Hillary started, she was a staff member at YLF because one of the staff who was also a special ed teacher invited her. And we really, yeah, part of my job, unwritten, is to hang out with the staff and to help out with morale. It's a very long week. And so Mallory and I developed a friendship over 2 days a year for about 8 years. And then during the pandemic, she was, like we all were isolated at home. And she said, "Hey, I had my COVID test. I got my COVID shot. I would love to come up and visit Montana and see Glacier Park and all that." And I said, "Yeah, come crash on my couch." And yeah, that really took our friendship to another level. And so, yeah, we met through the YLF. We ended up getting engaged at the Youth Leadership Forum the first year they came back in session. They do a big formal dinner for the students at the last night. And given that's where we met and where all of our friends, or a lot of our friends were anyway, um, yeah, I chose to propose at the YLF dinner. Uh,
What a d wow, what a I mean, I've known Mallory for a long time also, and, man, we got to talk a little bit at the Not Your Average Joe Gala last year when you emceed and, to
yeah,
see how well we have integrated our lives without knowing each other very well, and to see that we kind of, you know, float around with the same circle, and now that we're kind of well, not kind of, we are friends now. It's amazing to see how the disability community fights the same fight, and how it's really important to have people in your corner that are willing to fight with you. And I'm just so grateful that not only that I met you in partners, but we are now collaborating, with the DDCO and other things and being able to really manifest this friendship because I mean we need we need it in this community, man, because
yeah. Well, yeah,
nobody gets it. Nobody gets it except us. You know what I mean?
that's true. Yeah, and it's yeah, it's community. I mean, that's the other thing. When our history includes isolation, it doesn't mean we're not just not talking to other people and interacting. It also means we're not interacting with each other. And it's hard for a movement of any kind to gain momentum if you're not talking with the people that know what you're going through and know what you're working towards. So yeah, I'm a big fan of conversation. I think any kind of conversation and shared experience can lead to some really positive change.
Because I
Let's
mean, if you wouldn't have advocated for yourself and became an advocate, I mean, you wouldn't have been able to create an impact at YLF, and you wouldn't have been able to meet your lovely wife. And I mean, there's a lot of connecting factors there, my man.
Yeah, I know. It's yeah, the red strings on the board move in some
Sure.
different ways.
One of my favorite statistics to share with people is, what Al Condalucci shares is people with disabilities on average have about 50 meaningful connections, where people without a disability usually have about 150. And that blows people away. They don't realize the the difference in those connections that it's just harder to connect. Um,
Yeah, it's
Michael,
way hard. I'm surprised it's 50. I would have thought it was lower.
it might be
Uh,
25. It might be 25. I need
yeah.
to probably double
Well, yeah,
check that.
I've seen similar to statistics somewhere, and I've even seen they do the kind of the target chart where,
Yeah.
the inner circle is who is closest to you, and then associates and so on. I was at a conference recently, and it was actually for, PCAs, personal care attendant conference, and they talked about the similar statistics, which I'd heard before, but the part that they talked about was even of the, like, meaningful relationships outside of that immediate family core, if you're fortunate enough to have that, it was the how many quote unquote "meaningful relationships" do you have where the person you're interacting with isn't being paid? Which I
Oh,
think is
wow.
a whole nother level of
Yeah.
experience that I mean, unless you're ultra wealthy, other people don't spend a lot of time around folks that are being paid to hang around them or being paid to be around them. And that can be
Uh,
the only interaction somebody with a disability has is people being paid to be around you.
And it's those
And
kinds
that's a hard thing to.
it's those kinds of things I think it's important for parents to know, to learn, because then you can be
Mhm.
intentional about helping your child build those relationships and build those connections
yes.
outside of school, outside of those paid professionals. But it is something I think parents need to be intentional about. But if they don't know it's a problem, then they don't can't
Right.
address it. So,
No, it's actually yeah, my mom and I've gone rounds because it's also a very understandable outcome because if you're a parent, of a child with a disability, especially one with a lot of medical, like, you don't I mean, that kid in your eyes, that kid has gone through more than they ever should have in the first place and maybe for a lifetime, in a relatively short time. So you're not quick to put them into situations where they're going to be hurt again.
right.
No.
Uh, and there's nothing that hurts you more deeply or faster than personal relationships gone wrong. So,
Yeah.
it's a protective thing that keeps us from doing it. But, long term, you're right. It doesn't set the individual up for success or the
Well,
parent.
Can we
that's the thing is like with the disability community, the dignity of risk is really a thing.
Yeah,
can we
for
talk
sure.
about just kind of touching on what parents need to learn about? Um, why is it so important for families to understand, for parents to understand the history, of disability?
Mm. I wish I had a more original answer, but it really is the same one my high school teacher gave me when I said, "Why do we gotta learn this?" And she goes, "Yeah, because if you don't know it, it's so easy to repeat the mistakes of the past." So without being intentional about isolation or, not building that lack of confidence, it's very easy, even with the best intentions to like we just talked about, isolate your young person, and keep them from that kind of harm. But that also doesn't allow them to grow a layer of skin or confidence that can serve them. Because Bryce and I've talked about this and why I really love improv. Almost less as a performing art and more as a life tool because it builds confidence, but it's
Mhm.
also something you cannot master until you embrace failure.
Mm.
You're not going to get good at it until you fail over and over and over again. And in that failure, you're going to find your own voice. And you couldn't have done that until you experienced the embarrassment and the success of failing. So So yeah, it's hugely important, and for parents to know that our history as people with disabilities is really dark. I mean, without going into the entire lecture, it's out of sight, out of mind. And if I don't have to look at you, I don't have to deal with you. But that doesn't mean we go away. Just because you can't see us Just because you don't have to deal with us doesn't mean that our lives disappear. It just means that we experience a level of isolation and depression that was really forced upon us. So yeah, I think everybody understanding that history uh, is a positive thing.
Well, and I realize you don't have time to go into the entire lecture, but what what if you had to just pick one moment in history,
Mm.
disability history that, like, changed the direction of rights for people with disabilities, what would that be?
Um, I think the larger moment would be the 504 sit-ins for um uh s- the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 students was passed by Congress in 73, but was not signed into law by Health Education and Welfare Office until 1977. So, among other things, this law said that anything receiving federal funding could no longer discriminate on the basis of disability. So anybody that receives money from the government, whether it's education, forestry, parks and rec, if you receive federal money from the government, you can't discriminate based on someone's disability, which before 73 was perfectly legal. Um, and a big part of that was public education. So public education could no longer discriminate on the basis of disability if this law is signed into being. So we all knew that as a disabled community. But we sat there for 4 years knowing all that had to be done is for somebody to sign a piece of paper and this ocean of opportunity that hadn't existed could start existing for us. So, and we got, it's the same thing. It's, oh, we're getting to it. Oh, we got to iron it out. Oh, it's going to happen. But understanding that you can't be a bystander in your own life. So people with disabilities for the first time took that emotion of frustration and anger and isolation and sadness and organized around it to take over federal buildings in protest all across the country. The longest one being in San Francisco. They took over that building for 28 days until the federal government finally said, after enough media attention, which was spearheaded by the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers not only supported the movement, supported the takeover, but they were the first news organization because they had a paper back then to cover it. So without the Black Panthers, 504 never happens. Um, but that's where they had a federal hearing that said, finally, give us our building back. We'll listen to what you have to say. So that's the larger instance. For me and a lot of people, I know you all saw this video. Really, an awakening for me as an advocate was in that process. Judy Heumann, who an absolute rock star in the disability rights movement and just in the world, rest in power. Was in one of the ones that organized the San Francisco sit-in, and she was invited to testify about 504. And there's a moment in this testimony where she's at a microphone and her voice is shaking. She's a little bit afraid. But again, to your question, Bryce, you got to push yourself a little bit out of your comfort zone if you're going to call yourself a leader or an advocate. Um, and the camera flashes on the committee members, and they're all sitting there like, yeah, absolutely, that kind of deal. And she stops at the end of her testimony and looks straight at this person and says, and I would appreciate it if you stop nodding your head in agreement when, like, you know what I'm talking about, when I know that you have no idea what I'm talking about. And that was a really like bad version of the quote. But for me, that was it. Judy looking at that across the table and speaking into a microphone to that level of power and that level of misunderstanding and calling them out for shaking their head in agreement when they had no clue what it was she was talking about or what it felt like to be her. Yeah, that for me, that was it. I was done at that moment. I was like, well, if she's doing that, you know,
She was a she was an incredible human
Yeah,
being.
there's hope
and
for us.
What an amazing human.
yeah, she was.
Mhm.
It's just amazing to know that we have come so far, but yet we have so far to go. Like you showed us in Partners, a little clip from Christmas at Willowbrook with Geraldo Rivera, and
Mhm.
you just said, "I want you to sit and I want you to think about it and I want you to marinate how far we have come." When you said, "I want everybody to be silent in this room for a few minutes, and I want you to magnetize and think about how far we have come." What are those moments speak to you most about?
Those moments, yeah. I mean, how far we've come. But like you said, there's a long way to go, and the problem is it's not linear in the sense that once I take 3 steps forward, all I got to do is concentrate on the next step. And this is true in any kind of social justice or civil rights work, right? As or equity, as much as that's a bad word these days. By some is it's you're not only constantly trying to take the next step forward, the people opposing you, the thems, the people that don't want to see that change are constantly working with more resources, more money, and maybe um more influence to take those things away. So you're
Right.
trying to build a building where somebody is tearing apart the foundation. So you got to be paying attention to both, and that can be a tricky thing to navigate for a movement.
I remember you and I talking about in the parking lot of Partners in Policy Making after you got done speaking. I said I feel like they lower the standards for people with disabilities in life, and you said, "Brother, that's why we got to collaborate. That's why we got to become a family and a brotherhood. So when fight, we fight together, man." And I'm so thankful not only for your knowledge, but your friendship. And I really think that it's because of people like you and Judy Heumann and myself and Summer that have gotten tired of the the normal. And we're like, no, we've had enough. This has
Yeah.
gone on. This has gone on long enough. And we speak up for what we truly want. That's the only way we will be able to live a life the way we want to live.
Hell yeah. Well said. Well said, brother.
It definitely it's like one thing I'm learning is that we do have to keep fighting because when we stop fighting, the fight doesn't just go stale, but we go backwards very fast,
Yes.
very fast.
Yes.
Um, but Michael, so there is a lot to be it feels like there's a lot of negative going on in the disability world right now. Do you see any hope? What gives you hope right now?
Mm. Yeah, that's and it can be. It can be very and I get caught in this maybe once or twice a week. Just the weight of everything feels a little too heavy. But it's finding the good, it's finding the relationships. Working with young people gives me a lot of hope. Um, and understanding their perspective and the idea that we can come out of this. This um, no growth doesn't happen without pain. That's why we call them growing pains. We don't grow without pain, and we're certainly feeling pain right now. but that also means we have tremendous capacity to grow from this. So how do we come, because it's not always going to be, as Samwise Gamgee from Lord of the Rings famously put, there's still good in this world, Mr. Frodo. And from answering the questions how we got here, um, how do we get through this, and how do we keep this from happening again? We can come out a more evolved, more inclusive, more dynamic version of a movement that was already strong. I think this, if anything, can force the growth that might have taken longer. Because we realize we have to be more integrated. We have to communicate more. We have to have better relationships. And we have more allies than maybe we thought we did. Because if we're gonna fight for equity, I think that's something else that I think is an unintended byproduct of some of this is that without thinking about it, we isolate ourselves. You get around other people with disabilities that have a little bit of swagger and a little bit of confidence, and you're like,
Right.
yeah, yeah, this is it. This is where I want to work. This is where I want, which is great. But then you turn around and every relationship you have is around disability, and that's
Right.
not equity either.
No.
So it's understanding that balance that if our ultimate goal is to be integrated into society, we can't isolate society from ourselves. We
I
have to
love
invite
that.
it in. So that's where allies, that's where creativity happens. So yeah, I think some cool thing. It's dark right now, and we have to be ultra vigilant. But I think we're gonna come out with some really really cool things on the other side.
I think that is our first Lord of the Rings quote on where the ramp ends. I think that that was needed.
Well, and honestly, podcasts like this, conversations, where the ramp ends. Yeah, I said before we started, I love the title. It speaks to art. It speaks to poetry. It's those things we have in common, and I think it allows this podcast to have viewers outside of our own community, and I think that's what representation is. Representation isn't our own popularity. Representation is creating space where other people want to be involved with what we're doing. And I think for far too long, the messaging has been our success is capped. As people with disabilities, our success is capped at achieving what everyone else has already.
Yes.
When
Yes.
it's not, that is a level of success and representation. But real success means that we understand that we're capable of creating spaces far beyond what already exists and that other people can benefit.
Like I told Summer when this project first started getting kicked off and we were throwing ideas, I said, I want to be the social media influencer that, you know, kids and parents can come in and lock in and learn something, but also evolve with. I know better than anyone else, but I want to create a space and a life for myself that I can show my brothers and sisters in disability that if you want a career and if you want to make the money that you want to make and have a career and support yourself, you can do that. You don't have to live by the standards that society wants for you. If not that the things that the state provides aren't great, but I want more for my community. I want more voices to be heard in the community, more opportunities to be given in the community. And that doesn't happen until people like Summer and yourself and myself speak up and say, no, I want our community to be heard.
Hmm. Heck yeah. No, and that's it. You have to, and it's back to Summer's question about, you know, uh, really developing those relationships. and being intentional about it. Um, that's where um, that's what we gotta do. That's where the answer lies, is in building those relationships and developing that language for each other.
Yeah.
It's where the ramp ends.
That's wh
It's where the ramp ends. Exactly. So
Well, we're gonna
that's
wrap it up. I'm gonna let
yeah.
Bryce
Yep.
ask his final question, then I'm gonna let you have a chance to give any final thoughts before we sign off. But, Bryce, you wanna ask your final question?
Yes, this is kind of a fan favorite question, and it kind of materialized over. I just like to hear people's thoughts and perspectives. Mike, what do you want your legacy to be?
Oh, my legacy. Interesting. I think my legacy, if I can, I want my legacy to be that the same, similar to the mentors that I've been lucky to have, and still have to this day. I want, as a stage builder. So I want to, as much as I love standing on a stage and telling my story, I'm very cognizant of the fact that whether we're talking about 504 sit-ins or YLF or Richard Pryor or Robin Williams or Margaret Cho from the comedy side, I'm not able to stand on a stage that they didn't build by
Mm,
doing what they did. If I can, through, with my time on the stage, if I can build that stage uh, that is even better and includes more people for the next generation to stand on and have their individualism and their voices be heard in whatever that manifests itself, whether it's through words, music, education, whatever it might be. That's not for me to decide. But what I can do is be somebody that helps build that stage. I think that'd be a pretty cool legacy.
that's amazing, brother. And you're well on your way. And you know, you don't know how many people you've impacted. Summer and I included, and I'm sure the whole partners in policy making class in Oklahoma would say that you are probably one of the most beloved guests, at least in Oklahoma, and I'm sure across the United States. So we love having you on here. And for where the ramp ends, I'm Bryce.
I'm Summer.
And this is where the ramp ends and where your journey begins. Till next time, bye bye.